Hello, students. This is Mark Matson, and I'm trying to do this from my home since we can't meet together during this period of the COVID-19. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about Paul and his letters, in particular, trying to fit the letters that we're going to study in the next few weeks into some understanding of Paul's ministry that we've learned from Acts. So this is going to be kind of an introductory lecture, and then I have some other video lectures on other parts of Paul's letters. And then we're going to have to study quite a bit of this through my online notes in Canvas. But let's get started with this at any rate. So I want to take us back just a little bit to what we studied just before break. That is in the book of Acts, and particularly the latter half of the book of Acts. If you'll recall, in that latter part, starting at about chapter 14, the main character became Paul, not Peter, not the other disciples, but Paul takes center stage. And we meet Paul first in his conversion on the road to Damascus, and then he gets settled into the church of Antioch up in Syria. And what we learn then in the latter part of Acts is about Paul's extensive missionary activity throughout Asia Minor and Macedonia and Greece. And during this time, as you recall, he founded a number of churches. So let me kind of take us back and kind of review some of that activity as a framework for understanding his letters. So first of all, let's go to his first missionary journey. You recall that Paul sets off with Barnabas and John Mark, and they head first to the island of Cyprus. We don't know of any churches that he founded in Cyprus, but after a brief period of time, they head north and land in Asia Minor and head up into the region of Pisidia and Cilicia. And here they found four churches, Antioch of Pisidia, and Iconium, and Lystra, and Derbe. And in those four areas, they form churches. And you recall that the method that Paul does is he tends to go into a region and first preach the gospel to Jews in their local synagogue. And so in these areas, there must have been a number of Jewish inhabitants. But at some point, he moves his message out to the larger Gentile audience and founds a church, usually on the basis of both Gentiles and Jews in that church. He does that in these four areas, and then we hear that Paul and Barnabas returned back to the home base of Antioch in Syria. Now, at this point, clearly the inclusion of Gentiles was a problem, and we heard that Paul actually was sent down with Barnabas to Jerusalem to help resolve the questions of whether Gentiles needed to be circumcised in their inclusion in the church. We'll come back to that when we talk about the book of Galatians as well. But upon his return back to Antioch then, Paul sets off on his second missionary journey. And this one is quite a bit more extensive than the first one. Paul first heads back to those four churches we talked about in Pisidia and Cilicia, and kind of checks on them, makes sure that they're doing pretty well, and then he heads west. Now, Acts tells us ideally he would have liked to head northwest up into the region of Pontus and Bithynia on the Black Sea, but Acts says that the Holy Spirit hindered him from doing that, and so he ends up instead in the town of Troas on the Hellespont. That is, the Hellespont is the body of water which separates Asia from Europe. And he has a nighttime vision from somebody that he says was the man from Macedonia. And in this vision, this man from Macedonia appeals to him to come over to Europe, come over to Macedonia. So he does. And he lands first, or arrives first at the city of Philippi, and you remember from the story there that he meets a number of women down by the riverbank, Lydia being one of them, and he founds a church there in Philippi as his kind of his first church. From there he heads to Thessalonica, and then on to Berea. We know that he founded a church in Thessalonica, and we're not as sure about Berea, but he hits those two areas, kind of moving westward, and then he moves south to Athens, where he preaches at Mars Hill, and then ends up in Corinth, where he stays for about 18 months. He awaits Timothy and Silas to come back and meet him. He'd left them in Macedonia. And he spends quite a bit of time preaching and teaching in this major metropolitan area there in Corinth. Um, and he then, at the end of that ministry period, he heads to Ephesus for a very brief period of time, where a church already has been founded, and then heads back down to Jerusalem and then home to Antioch. So in this second missionary journey, we have now founded churches in Macedonia, Philippi, Thessalonica, and in Achaia, in Corinth, um, and and these become fairly active churches that he's gonna communicate with in the next stage. The third missionary journey then is quite a bit different. Paul heads inland directly and goes directly to Ephesus, where we think he stayed for maybe up to about 3 years. There's a lot of evidence that we can put together that he was there in Ephesus for at least 2.5 years or so. He has quite a few controversies. One of them with the Guild of Silversmiths, who are upset because he's hurting their trade in fashioning and selling these little silver images of Artemis, the goddess. But at any rate, he's in Ephesus, and I think quite a bit of activity takes place here during this activity in Ephesus. At the end of his period in Ephesus, he heads back and revisits all his churches in Asia, in Greece and Macedonia. That he revisits Corinth, and he revisits Thessalonica, and he revisits Philippi, and then finally he heads back down to Jerusalem. And we know that he's aware that this is his last journey, because in Acts 20 he tells the church in the Ephesian elders that he knows that he'll never see them again. And sure enough, when he gets to Jerusalem, he's arrested and cast into prison in Caesarea, because the Jewish authorities have accused him before the Roman authorities, who were situated in Caesarea. At the end of about a year and a half in prison, he finally appeals to Rome and is sent to Rome, and then he's in prison again in Rome for quite a period of time. So now, with this kind of story of Paul's ministry, let's try to make some sense of the various letters that we have in the Pauline corpus. Well, during Paul's 18-month stay in Corinth, we know that two letters were written from there. So these are his earliest letters. In fact, they're the earliest letters in the New Testament. The letter of First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians. He writes to the church in Thessalonica, where he had left Timothy and Silas, and so we have quite a bit of engagement there in a very early stage, where he is expressing his desire to come see them again, and talks quite a bit about correcting their maybe disinformation about the resurrection. So these are very early. You'll see here that I also have put Galatians in this early stage. Now, we don't know for sure when Galatians was written. There's just no internal information that really helps us capture that. But you recall that at the end of the first missionary journey and before the second, we had the controversy about the inclusion of Gentiles, where Paul was sent back down to Jerusalem. And that's what the topic of Galatians is all about. It's about how Paul makes sense of Galatians being in the church, and he writes to some churches that apparently are also having Judaizers come in and trouble them. Now, so this could have been written any time from about the end of the first missionary journey, or possibly all the way to the end of the third missionary journey, because this issue of the inclusion of Gentiles into a Jewish church continues to be a recurring issue. But I'm going to place it here early, because I think actually that it probably comes fairly early in his ministry. Well, from this stage, then, we move to the next set of letters that Paul wrote, and these would have been written during his stay in Ephesus. And we know this fairly certainly, that in Ephesus he writes to the Corinthian church a couple of times, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And we know this because of a lot of internal discussion within the book itself that talks about people coming to visit him and a series of letters that he has written to them. And it's very convenient to have letters go back and forth across the Aegean Sea. Um, Also, it is very likely from this period that here in Ephesus that he would have also written Philemon, because Philemon was an escaped prisoner, or actually Onesimus is the prisoner, Philemon was his owner, but Philemon is situated in Colossae, which is a very close distance from Ephesus, and it would make sense that an escaped prisoner would have had to be of close geographical proximity. So it makes sense that it would be written during this period. I'll talk more about Philemon in a second and when it was written. I have one other early letter, and for at least from the Ephesian period here on this slide, and that is Romans. And while Romans wasn't written from Ephesus, it was written right at the end of that Ephesian period, as Paul travels back to Corinth to make his final sweep of all the churches in Greece and Macedonia. He writes to Rome from Corinth again. So he's back at Corinth for a brief period of time. And we know from some internal discussions, especially in chapter 16, that there has been this communication between Corinth and Rome. And so this is likely when he wrote Romans. Now, in this period, we also have three more letters that we term the prison epistles. And that's because in these epistles, in these letters, Paul specifically mentions the fact that he writes from being in prison. Well, when was Paul in prison? Well, I indicated earlier that he was in prison in Caesarea at the end of his third missionary journey. And then a little bit after that, after a sea journey to Rome, he was imprisoned again in Rome at the very end of his ministry. So we know those are two possibilities. But it is very likely also that he was imprisoned in Ephesus. There's nothing specific in Acts about that or in his letters, but there are a bunch of allusions in his letters to the fact that he faced beatings and imprisonments, and these would all fit very well into the period of Ephesus, of his stay in Ephesus. And it's my belief that these three prison epistles also come from this period in his stay in Ephesus. Specifically, the epistles we're talking about are Philippians, Colossians, and Ephesians. And in fact, in a bit later, when we study Ephesians and Colossians, I'm going to make the argument that Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, these three, were all written at about the same period of time and all from Ephesus. And of course, that would mean that the book of Ephesians is not written to Ephesus, but from Ephesus, and we'll talk about my rationale for that as well. But we have these three prison epistles, which I would also place in this Ephesian ministry period. Now that leaves three more letters in the Pauline corpus, and these we cluster together and call the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are written not to churches, but to individuals, specifically to Timothy and Titus, who were young ministry associates of Paul, and he has placed them in charge of various churches, Timothy in Ephesus and Titus on Crete. And these letters are written to them individually to assist them in their own work as young ministers, as young pastors in these churches. There's some question whether Paul actually wrote these letters, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But if they were written by Paul, they certainly were written way at the end, likely in his period of stay in Rome. So this completes the listing of Paul's letters, and here's how we're going to kind of cover it in this course. I'm going to first of all cover the very early letters all together. We're going to talk about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, all kind of clustered together as Paul's early letters. And then we're going to move to two letters that I consider to be kind of the mature Paul thinking, his most theological thinking, his most deep thinking, and that's the book of Romans and Ephesians, probably written from about the same time period, if I'm right about when Ephesians is written, and 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 Romans, that likely would have been within maybe a month or two of one another. And so we'll deal with that, and then we'll turn and consider the last of the prison epistles. And here I'll kind of try to wrap together this argument about why Colossians and Ephesians and Philemon would have been uh, clustered together. And Philippians itself is rather a beautiful letter, actually, a beautiful warm letter that Paul writes to his church in Philippi, and it's worth spending quite a bit of time there examining as well, especially the Christ hymn in chapter 2. So so from there, then we'll finally wrap up our Pauline study of Pauline epistles with a look at the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy and Titus, and then kind of draw all that to a close as we turn finally to the other parts of the New Testament, the Catholic epistles, Hebrews, um, Peter, James, and then finally to the book of Revelation. But that's towards the end of the semester. Um, so what we're going to do at this stage is I have a couple other videos on Thessalonians and Corinthians, on Galatians, um, and you're going to be reading extensively the material that I have in Canvas, and we'll have to substitute some of my lectures for material that's actually written down. But we will cover this material well, and hopefully within a few weeks we'll be back together again, and we can deal with the rest of the New Testament as a group in class together. So for now, study well, enjoy your period of time learning in an online environment. I do want to say, if during this entire period, if you have any questions, any issues at all, feel free to write me an email, to send me a text, call me if you want to. I really want this period not to interfere with your learning at all, and so I'll do anything I can to help bridge the gap during this period. Blessings on you all, and we'll continue to be in touch. Thank you.